Uh, I'm going to talk today about some problems in interpretation and analysis of Semitic emphatics. In fact, it's less of a survey than I'd initially intended it to be, and it's kind of more on the background to how one can view the problem of analysing Semitic emphatics and how one might begin to analyse them. So. Kind of a journey, should we say? Let's say it's a journey into the world of Semitic emphatics and just considering some of the problems in their interpretation and analysis. To begin to understand what the emphatic phenomenon is, of course, we have to consider both the diachronic and the synchronic perspectives. And what I want to do today is to pull that together. I know that in these seminars, there have been various aspects of emphatics that have been talked about. So I want to kind of pull some things together. We, of course, have to look at the historical development of emphatics. We, of course, have to consider what we think we mean by the word emphatic. And I want to very briefly touch on some of the terminological issues with that. We have to consider a number of types of analysis because there may be different perspectives from which people want to view emphatics. So, above all, what we need to keep in mind generally when we're thinking about emphatics is that emphatics have different manifestations and show different behaviour, not only across languages, but also within languages. And so all of this can appear to be quite complex to unravel, but I've done a considerable amount of kind of unraveling. And once you start unraveling, a very interesting typology emerges. So what I want to do today is to start presenting to you, or to give you a flavour of how one can look at emphatics typologically. It's not going to be a complete overview of emphatics in all of the Semitic languages and an analysis of that, because we don't have time for that. So this typology is the topic of my long-term but current book project that now I'm finishing up in Durham, I will be able to, I'm starting to get back to. So today I'll touch upon a few of the problems that muddy the emphatic waters, if you like, and I'll touch on two of the two major components of a three-dimensional typology. So you'll see that there's quite an interesting story to tell about emphatics, and that's what I hope to give you a flavour of, and hope that some of this resonates with you from some angle. So today I'm going to start by considering very, very briefly some ideas of how we might describe what an emphatic is, simply from a terminological perspective. I'm not going to go into details in the phonetics of it. We've done some of that before, and that would take up a whole session today. So I'll very briefly touch upon some of the problems in assumptions underlying terminology and transcription. What I want to do is to consider emphatics from the Arabic perspective, because I think more of what we've talked about in these workshops is from the modern South Arabian perspective, which actually is the really interesting work. But there are a couple of key things about Arabic emphatics that I think are very useful to consider, especially if you are working on the phonology and phonetics of modern South Arabian. So we'll consider that from a synchronic perspective. Quick overview of the diachronic perspective, that is Semitic emphatics historically, because that is what you need to give you the picture for Arabic. I'll talk about emphatic phonation contrasts. I will then talk about emphatics as a resonance contrast, so phonation contrast and resonance contrast, and then just a quick coming back to a summary of the emphatic trajectory, the development of emphatics. So there are numerous problems in considering emphatics that can actually influence the analysis because of inherent assumptions. So that comes down to even terminology and transcription. So that's where I'm going to start now. Sorry, folks, I realised I haven't moved my screen on when I'm moving the wrong screen on. There we are. This is the screen I have just talked you through. It's just a quick overview or a preview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm having to operate two screens slightly separately. I'm not quite sure why. Anyway, never mind. This is the joy of working on Zoom. So the first thing then, when we start to consider the question of what is an emphatic, is down to terminology, because when you start looking at, when you start doing the research and reading the literature, you immediately come across the problem of terminology, which is that different people use different terminology, which may be phonetic. It's very often the terminology is comes from articulatory phonetics, which may or may not be intended to be taken as a phonological category. And it kind of causes problems because you then don't know whether something's being considered from a purely phonetic point of view, whether it's being considered from a phonological point of view. It's then hard to see, it's hard then to look at it diachronically, because, for instance, if you call emphatics pharyngalized consonants, you then don't have a very easy way of being able to talk about ejectives in Semitic, which actually, of course, are related because they are also emphatics. So the term emphatic is used broadly as a term across the Semitic languages because it shows you what the cognates are across Semitic, even where there may not be a very initially obvious phonetic link between them. They may sound very different. They may have very different phonological behavior, but historically they all arise from this category of emphatics. So this is why we use the term emphatic, but of course that itself can conceal any natural class or any common phonological behavior of emphatics that you then may see in other languages. So, for example, if you wanted to look at how velarization manifests in, I don't know, Russian or Marshallese or something, it's quite tricky then to compare that with the scenario in, say, Arabic. If we're calling them emphatics, you know, it may obscure when you start to do the research. You know, you have to kind of pull all these terms together. So are you using a term from a phonetic perspective? Are you using it to describe phonological behavior? How can you compare that across Semitic? And then how can you compare it outside of Semitic? So these are problems to do that immediately hit us. And if we adopt a certain terminology, does that mean that we are limited to viewing something from a very one-sided perspective? That is, if we talk about the emphatics, let's say in Arabic, as pharyngalized segments, does that then mean that all we're looking at is some category of pharyngalization and we miss some of the other behavior, or we miss some of the historic realities of the emphatics across Semitic? Terms can also be misleading because, for instance, if you want to talk about something as pharyngalized, you can't compare Arabic pharyngalization. Well, you can compare it, but it's not the same thing. Pharyngalization of consonants in Arabic with so-called pharyngalization in the Northeast Caucasian languages, where it sounds a little bit different, but it has the same name, pharyngalization, but it phonologically behaves very differently. So they're all quite problematic terms. So these are just some of the terms that people use. And of course, the term emphasis is a little bit difficult to use because then we start thinking that we're talking about stress and intonation rather than about resonance patterning. Part of the problem is that the category of emphatic across Semitic has changed historically. So it's not just that they've come to be something slightly different. It's that emphatic, the category or the place of emphatics within the sound system has changed, and that I'm going to talk about a little bit presently. So another problem, of course, is that of transcription, and what transcription we use to transcribe emphatic consonants, because actually, of course, something crucial that I've missed out here, I realise, is that of the ejectives. and which I'm going to go through, or I'm going to talk about objectives a little bit today. So are emphatics pharyngalized? Are they uvularized, velarized? Are they dark as opposed to light? Or are they ejectives? You know, this different identity, or what could appear to be a phonetic identity, means that we're likely to transcribe them differently, and that's not very easy as a researcher. If you're going through literature, if you're ploughing through, you know, a grammar sketch of this language and a grammar sketch of that language, and you see sort of transcriptions and you're not sure whether it's related to what you're working on. So transcription is also a problem, and it's a problem then when you look at how the effects, the resonance effects of emphaticness spread in Arabic. How do you transcribe that? So all of these are problems that are inherent in researching emphatics and in descriptions and analyses that have been done of emphatics. So that kind of is because the question of what is an emphatic is actually really quite complex to unravel. So what I'm going to do now is some unraveling. I don't have an answer to the question of how best, what terminology we should use, because I think it depends on what type of analysis you're doing and what perspective you're looking at. And neither do I have an answer to the question of how should one transcribe emphatics, because I think it really depends what aspect of emphatics it is that you're looking at. You know, and are you looking at phonetics? Are you looking at phonology? Are you comparing them with something outside of Semitic, or is it only within Semitic? I think you would use a different transcription depending on who you're talking to and what kind of analysis you're doing. I want to go back to some data, and I want to think a little bit more about what emphatics are. And as I said, today I'm going to consider mostly Arabic because this was my own starting point, and I think that a discussion of modern South Arabian phonological systems, including emphatics, needs far more time than I've got today. I think you need, you know, an entire conference actually on phonology of modern South Arabian systems, because they're all very different and the emphatics behave differently, and even within modern South Arabian it's quite hard to disentangle the behavior of the emphatics. So I'm going to start with Arabic, and I hope that that will present a useful picture. So Arabic is useful in terms of an illustration of historical change and of how phonological systems line up differently. So the picture that emerges is one in which emphatics play a different role within the sound system, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So it's well known that Arabic has a set of so-called pharyngalized or velarized or uvularized or somehow back coronal consonants, and this is kind of everybody's starting point on emphatics. So these are consonants that are made with constriction by the front part of the tongue and a narrowing of the pharynx in some part of the pharynx. So that much we know. Now, the consonants in standard Arabic, as seen in its writing system, are ba, sa, ba, and va. Okay, so that's orthographic or standard Arabic. So we see, for instance, that in Arabic you've got a contrast between a plain t and an emphatic a, a plain s and an emphatic sa, and so on. Now, of course, in the modern vernaculars, there's considerable variation. So some peripheral dialects don't have emphatics at all. Most dialects do have some emphatic consonants, and most dialects have at least the consonants a, sa, and either da or va, but not all of them. Some of them have, or most dialects have either va or ba, but not both. But there are some dialects that have both, and there are some dialects in which the ba is, of course, actually not ba, but va, as we know. But on the whole, a majority of dialects have ba, sa, and then either da or va, and often the dialects that have da will also have a za. Okay, So there has been some change that has happened across the Arabic dialect groups. Additionally, most dialects then have some more emphatics. So the coronals, I've already mentioned za, but coronal ra and la in particular. So for example, we find many dialects will have a contrast between wallah, by God, and with the emphatic, compared with wallah, meaning he commissioned, right? Where the contrast is purely one of emphaticness and non-emphaticness. We may or may not then also find an emphatic ma, right? The coronal, nasal coronal. Some dialects then also have words with other emphatic consonants, or consonants that may be that people have defined as emphatic, like a labial ba and a velar ga. So this is typical of, in particular, dialects like Baghdadi Arabic, where the word for heart is galub, where you don't have the coronal emphatic, you don't have a ta, sa, or ba in it, or a ta, sa, va rather, but it's clearly backed, it clearly sounds emphatic, and people will think of it as being mufakham or backed, okay, and it has that effect on the vowels too. So then the questions that gives rise to are, what exactly is emphatic typologically, and what is the reason for emphatics varying so much even across Arabic dialects? Okay, yeah. So the next point, of course, about Arabic emphatic consonants, and this is related, as I mentioned, to the case of Iraqi Arabic or Baghdadi Arabic that I just highlighted with the lexeme Golub. The next point is that this emphaticness, this emphatic quality, can be heard throughout the word. So for instance, let's have a look at some Syrian data where you have words that have an emphatic, a coronal emphatic like fa in them, that can have an effect across the word, so that you end up with a minimal pair such as balqa, meaning axe, and belda, meaning township, where balqa has got a fa in it, but the entire word is very clearly back sounding, whereas belda, you can hear it in the ba, you can hear it in the vowels, that there is no emphaticness, there's no emphatic quality to that word. So the only underlying difference between these words is the emphatic fa versus the plain d, but the entire word sounds different. So this, of course, has been the subject of many years and years and years of scholarly debate. A couple of examples from a Syrian Arabic speaker from Damascus that I recorded quite a few years ago now, before the war.
10.
Sorry, that's it. It's I'm afraid PowerPoint, this latest version of PowerPoint seems to cut things off very slightly.
10.
I should have realised.
10.
Oh, and then
10.
that's it. So you can hear it on tel tal, and you can hear it on teen teen. So you can hear, in particular with an a, but you can hear it even with the contrast between tin and teen, that you can hear that there is an effect on other parts of the word, and it's not only that there is a contrast between a t and a fa. I want to now give a little overview of some history of the development of emphatics. So we know that across Semitic there is a series of contrasts in the obstruent system such that there is a triadic system. There's a series of triads in reconstructions of historical Semitic, such that we can ask, to start, rewind to the beginning, what were emphatic consonants historically? So we know that in early Semitic, or what we might suppose to be the genetic ancestor of Semitic languages, that we have these series of triads, and that within those triads, it's increasingly becoming the consensus across across researchers that the emphatics of these triads, the emphatic member of these triads, were actually ejectives. And this is sort of fairly controversial, or has been fairly controversial, because until not so long ago, it was commonly assumed that the emphatics of early Semitic must have just been like they are in Arabic today. But it's increasingly become the consensus, and it's the conclusion, you know, when I've kind of looked into it too, you know, I think this is absolutely the only conclusion one can draw, is that the early emphatics were in fact ejectives. So early Semitic, with its reconstruction of the series of triads of consonants, what we find is that we'll have triads such as the following: t, d, t, however you want to. I mean, these of course are transcriptions, you know, a reconstruction of a historical ancestor. It's a reconstruction, it's a hypothesis. So we can't, there weren't any recorders to record what they actually sounded like. And of course, they've developed very differently in these. Now, this means then that the contrast that we see in these triads is primarily a phonatory contrast, where phonatory refers to the action of the larynx, such as voicing and aspiration. And in this case, then a difference between voiced and voiceless and ejective. And I shall come back to that presently. So then, yeah, so what we see then in the early Semitic appears to be similar to the systems that we see today in the Ethio-Semitic languages. So in the Ethio-Semitic languages, what we find is a three-way contrast, a triadic contrast in the obstruent system between voiced and aspirated and ejective consonants. So in Tigrinya, which is spoken in Eritrea and northern Ethiopia, what we see, for instance, in the coronal series is a series of stops where we have d, t, and t, where the emphatic member is the ejective t. In the fricative series, we have z, s, and t, where the t is the emphatic member. The ejective is actually cognate with emphatics in other Semitic languages. And we have a velar series, g, k, and k, where the emphatic is actually what's cognate with the Arabic half. And I'm going to play you some examples of that. So these are examples, these are tokens of the velar stop series in Tigrinya. There we are, sorry, wrong screen, there we are.
Get up.
So I'll play these 3 times each.
Get up. Get up. Kabdi. 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 Karni. Karni. Karni.
So what we see is that there's a phonological contrast in the velar series between the voiced g and the voiceless aspirated k, and the ejective, the emphatic k sound, which I'll just play again.
Karni. Karni.
And the word qarni is actually cognate with the Arabic word qarn. It's the nisba adjectival form, meaning, you know, animal with a horn, qarni. So yeah, something with horn, if you like. So this is going to sound awful, but horny, but from the perspective of an animal that has a horn. So qarni is cognate with Arabic qarn. And that then, sorry, I seem to have, sorry, I'm trying to manage 2 screens, as I said. So the Ethio-Semitic language Tigrinya, as I mentioned, the emphatic t of Tigrinya is actually cognate with Arabic ba, and the emphatic k is cognate with Arabic r, and the emphatic t is cognate with the Arabic sa. So another couple of examples. So I'll play you an emphatic t, and then a word that contains both an emphatic k and an emphatic t sound. So they're all ejectives.
Tazaz, tazaz, tazaz. Curtsy, curtsy, curtsy.
Okay, so these are just so that you can hear what the emphatics of Tigrinya sound like. So then, just a quick, sorry, this is really leaping around and I don't quite know why. Just a quick side note on ejectives, because it's a topic that I've been very interested in for a long time. Ejectives are not at all rare across the world's languages. They are, in fact, the fourth most common type of stop cross-linguistically, and ejectives occur in about 18 to 20% of the world's languages, depending on which research you look at. Madison says that it's around 18%, and Catford says it's around anywhere up to about 20% of the world's languages have ejectives. Now, different languages may phonologically contrast them with voiceless aspirated obstruents or with plain, that is unaspirated voiceless obstruents. So it's very clear that ejectivity, being an ejective, is not just a phonetic feature, but it's phonologically contrasted. There was a really nice example that came up yesterday, the opening of the Wimbledon tennis yesterday. There was a Georgian player who was beaten by Andy Murray, who was knocked out by Andy Murray, but his name, Nikolos, in fact contains an ejective, and this is the tennis player Nikolos Basilashvili. This is his own pronunciation of his name.
Nikolos Basilashvili. Nikolos Basilashvili.
So that's an ejective in Georgian. You can hear the ejective "r" in Georgian. So it was just a nice example because I'm very interested in Caucasian languages, not so much Georgian, but it was a nice example that was in the news yesterday.
Alex, sorry, brief interruption. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Ah, right. Okay. Let's move on. So, oops. Yeah. So I just wanted then to run through a couple of the phonetics or some articulation on phonation, sounds phonated via the vocal folds, as you can see on the slide in front of you. So what I want to actually get onto is the types of contrast that you get in the world's languages, such that we can schematize the most common types of phonation contrast, and the four most common types, of course, we can schematize where we have ba with a voice lead, we have pa, which we can think of as neutral, we have pa with a lag, and we have a with a silent lag. So that in perceptual terms, we see combinations of quantity of silence or noise with quality of silence or noise, and this can be exploited across the system of obstruents and sonorants depending on the language. So then to go back to phonation in obstruents to see how the contrast is exploited linguistically, we can see that this allows for languages to have different paradigms. So we find 3 types of phonation paradigms across languages, as we see, for instance, between, let's say, French and Thai and Gujarati, such that French has voiced versus voiceless, bo po. Thai has voiced versus voiceless aspirated, ba, pa, pa. And Gujarati then has an additional breathy contrast. So you have bar, por, pods, and bar. Okay. So other languages then have ejectives and some have implosives in their phonation systems. So I showed you that Ethio-Semitic languages like Tigrinya have a 3-way phonation contrast between fully voiced, aspirated and ejective, and that's what we reconstruct for early Semitic. So then where do other Semitic languages fit into that? So this is where we can look at Arabic, because it's quite interesting to see how Arabic doesn't have only one phonation paradigm. So we find that in Arabic, some speakers have a 2-way or what I call a dyadic contrast between voiced obstruents and between voiceless and slightly aspirated obstruents. But what's interesting is that this is not across Arabic, because actually some speakers of Arabic have a three-way contrast between voiced, between voiceless unaspirated, and between voiceless aspirated. Okay, so a d, ba, and t type of system. But what's very interesting is that this is not just random speakers, but it's due to systematic dialect variation. And so in a nutshell, it's because you can divide Arabic dialect into two groups, so those with a dyadic phonation contrast and those with a triadic phonation contrast. Some examples from, let's say, Damascene and Baghdadi Arabic. Just play you, yeah, so I'm going to play you so that you can hear the difference between Damascene and Baghdadi.
Tal, tel, tal, tel.
So that's where they're all voiceless and slightly aspirated, and there's no phonation contrast between the pa and the t, whereas in Baghdadi there is. The pa is voiceless and the t is voiceless aspirated.
طبعا طبعا ترى ترى.
And this is quite consistent across these dialects. Okay, I'm going to whip through those because looking across dialects, you can see this repeated again and again across the dialect of Arabic. It's quite consistent. So then emphatics were part of the phonation contrast system. Whereas what's interesting in Arabic is that the emphatics are now part of a resonance contrast system, where it's no longer only the obstruents, but it's all the phonemes that seem to participate in this resonance contrast system. So the whole sound system has undergone a historical shift, and this is what you can see across Semitic languages. And what's very interesting is looking across this trajectory of development of emphatics and this historical relining up of the system and seeing how the various Semitic languages fit into that trajectory. So what we find in Arabic is that the emphatics are just no longer part of the phonation system, which was related to only a small set of consonants, but we see a remnant of this in the triadic dialects like Baghdadi. You know, the change has not been completed. So this then kind of brings us full circle, and we can go back to our observation that emphatic consonants spread their emphatic colouring to the surrounding consonants and vowels. And this colouring, this emphatic colouring of surrounding consonants and vowels is what I'm referring to as resonance. So Arabic then fully exploits contrast of resonance, what we might call dark and light resonance, so that we get an entire system of consonant and vowel harmony. This was recognized, of course, by Sibawayh, the 9th century grammarian of Arabic, who partially recognized that, calling it tafkhim for the darkness harmony, and then imala for the lightness harmony. This is interestingly also where dialects differ, because some Arabic dialects have a basic distinction between an E colour versus an R colour, whereas some dialects have a resonance distinction between a three-way E and R and U colour. So that what we actually find is that we have what I call dichotomic dialects like Damascene, where you have a contrast between R and E resonance, so Elb and Kazim and Barbi, whereas you get trichotomic dialects like Baghdadi, in which you get a contrast between R and E and U resonance, such that the words that I've just given you for Damascene, you have Golub and Kavum and Toba, where you have labial colouring, this U resonance as well. So without going into the detail of that, because that would be for a longer talk, starting to wrap up, we see that the emphatics tell an important story about historical change in the overall systems of Arabic dialects, and also of the place of the Arabics, plural, within general Semitic phonology. So a diachronic and a synchronic approach, looking at sound systems holistically, is what I call a three-dimensional approach. And we can classify Arabic dialects typologically along these two dimensions of phonation and resonance. And this is how you can look at other Semitic languages outside of Arabic too. So beyond Arabic, we can see it in the other Semitic languages. We can even look outside of Semitic languages because there are some contact effects with language groups sort of on the peripheries of Semitic speaking areas too. Yeah. So then, that then brings us on to having a look at it, from a perspective of this new kind of phonological typology, so that
Sorry, it's me jumping in again. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay, so so this is what I'm now writing up into a monograph, essentially. There's been little research into emphatics as the starting point for a holistic typology cutting across Arabic synchronically and Semitic diachronically, and then positioning it into cross-linguistic typologies of resonance on the one hand and phonation on the other, and little research into how these kinds of typologies intersect with aerial phenomena. And I want to then, I said that at the end I was going to then move back to this idea of the development of emphatics. And it's interesting to look at this emphatic trajectory where you start off with this reconstruction of Proto-Semitic as having emphatics and non-emphatics being glottalic versus aspirated, which is where we see the Ethio-Semitic languages, and how that then develops through a gradual loss of glottalization. I don't seem to have a pointer on here. Gradual loss of glottalization that you can see under the emphatic column here, gradually moving from glottalic through to glottalic backed, losing its aspiration and then being just sort of somehow backed, resonance quality. And the non-emphatic obstruents then, the voiceless non-emphatic will be aspirated, and eventually it loses the phonation contrast, becomes unimportant, and it gradually becomes a contrast of resonance. And what we see is that some Arabic dialects, the triadic dialects, are at stage 3 of the trajectory, whereas the dyadic dialects are at stage 4, the end point of this trajectory. What's very interesting is the research emerging on modern South Arabian languages and how they then fit into, or how we can view them in terms of this type of historical development. So I'll wrap it up there, Janet. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.